9 creepy and obscure unsolved mysteries. Mysteries stir our curiosity, mesmerizing us until they can be solved. Though supernatural causes or conspiracy theories are more fun to think about, mysteries often end up with surprisingly banal explanations. However, there are cases which remain unsolved, perhaps forever, and they are often the most intriguing.
1. The murder of Julia Wallace. It was the taxi driver who let it slip. Kevin and Julie were being driven home after a night out in Liverpool. Wolverton Street, eh? What number? 29. Dreway. True, 10 Rillington Place may have more of a ting-a-ling ring to it, but 29 Wolverton Street looms almost as large in murderous lore and legend. This bijou, terraced house in Anfield is the cat's pajamas for Britain's murder fanciers. 70 years ago, it was the setting for the most baffling whodunit in the annals of crime. Close the door, light the light. Forget Kafka and Poe. Welcome to the Wallace case. We'd been here a couple of months before the taxi driver told us, says Kevin Firth, 27. The agent never told us, the people we bought it off never told us, and the old couple next door were horrified that we didn't know. Had I known this house had been the scene of a murder, I'd never have moved in, says Kevin's partner, Julie Sames, 25. Kevin himself is a tad more pragmatic. Wish I had known, he smiles. I'd have asked for a bit more off the price. The price was £34,950. That was 4.5 years ago. Kevin and Julie were delivering election leaflets along Wolverton Street, and liked the feel of this hush-filled cul-de-sac. Unlike many other parts of inner Liverpool, this is not poor-quality Victorian property. The houses, built in 1912, are of good grade red glazed brick, and come with bathroom, hot and cold running water and inside lavatory. The ceilings are high and the rooms feel airy. There was more than one house for sale, but Kevin and Julie settled on number 29 because the occupiers had fitted it out to their taste. In any case, it was towards the blind end of the street, and quieter. In 1931, whoever murdered Julia Wallace by beating her to death in the front parlour figured this, too? Either it was her husband, the scrawny insurance agent William Herbert Wallace, or, if it wasn't, declared the critic James Agate, then here at last is the perfect murder. It was Tuesday, January 20th, a numbing, black night. The neighbors, a couple called Johnstone, had been on their way out, when they stumbled on Wallace looking agitated in the rear entry. He told them he'd been out for a couple of hours, returning home to find all the doors locked against him. Mr. Johnston suggested trying again. "It opens now," murmured Wallace, disappearing through the back door. Moments later he was back. "Come and see," he exclaimed. "She's been killed." Wallace's tale was a strange one. On the evening before the killing, he had gone to play chess at a cafe in central Liverpool, arriving to find that a message had been telephoned to the cafe not half an hour before. Wallace was to call the following evening at 7:30 at 25 Menlove Gardens East. Although not knowing the caller, who gave his name as R.M. Qualdraw, Wallace, scenting commission, kept the appointment. On the next night, leaving Julia sniffling at the back gate, Wallace said he'd taken a series of trams to the leafy suburb of Allerton. But Menlove Gardens turned out to be a triangular affair, and while there was a Menlove Gardens North, South and West, there was no Menlove Gardens East. Nor had anyone heard of R.M. Qualdraw. Back home, there was Julia, dead on the rug. Now the nightmare began in earnest. The police piled in, led by the half-cut SID chief, Dead Superintendent Moore, who almost tripped over the pathologist, down on all fours observing the progress of rigor mortis. "No need to take the rectal temperature," said Professor McFall. Mrs. Wallace had been dead a good 4 hours. And that meant that Wallace did it before setting out for Menlove Gardens. Superintendent Moore liked the sound of that. Little house, big crowds, police, doctors, photographers, neighbors. Blood all over the parlor, pools on the carpet, spurts and stipples on the walls and pictures. Under the body, a blood-stained mackintosh. "Is this yours, Mr. Wallace?" It was. But at the Anfield Bridewell, Wallace, his clothes, boots, hands, hair, even his Crippnesquire-rimmed glasses, were all blood-free. Neighbors in Wolverton Street said the Wallaces were a queer couple, dingy and withdrawn. Married for 16 years, no children. Wallace, tall, cadaverous, played chess and the fiddle, looked like a murderer. Julia came down in the world when she married him. McFall reported she was wearing patched-up corsets when he found her. Moore was convinced that Wallace was Qualtra. By a fluke, the mysterious call to the chess club was traced to a kiosk just 400 yards from Wallace's front door, and smack bang next to the tram stop for central Liverpool. So, Moore concluded, Wallace made the Qualtra call, left a message, hopped on a tram, got to the cafe, picked up the message. Frontispiece for the perfect alibi. But the whole case turned on time. To catch the tram that took him to Menlove Gardens, Wallace would have had to have left home no later than 6.49. But a milk boy swore seeing Julia alive on her front doorstep at 6.45. In the time available, could Wheezy Wallace, at 52, a heavy smoker, out of condition with a chronic kidney complaint, really have stripped naked, wearing the Macintosh to shield himself from splashing blood, bludgeoned his wife to death, cleaned and secreted the murder weapon, never found, faked a burglary, attended to various gas jets, fires, locks and bolts, and dressed himself for a journey across Liverpool, calm and composed, on a winter's night? A dozy Liverpool jury thought he could. Wallace was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. He got off on appeal, left Wolverton Street and his suspicious neighbours, and moved across the Mersey to a bungalow in the Wirral. He died a broken man less than 2 years later, having first fingered a local Jack the Lad, rather foppish, wears spats, very plausible, as his own prime suspect. But that's another story. The house is snug, but not cramped, its geography almost unchanged since Wallace's day. A bigger bathroom has taken a chunk out of the third back bedroom, that Wallace used as an amateur laboratory. Modern frames have replaced the original sash windows in the front bays. Julia's post-Edwardian clutter, etched in the flashlight of the police photographer, has made way for TV and stereo equipment in the pastel-painted front room. You have to accept that living here means a certain amount of hassle, Julie explains. What's certain is that the story won't go away. I'd feel obliged to tell a prospective buyer, Kevin says, and in any case, like us, they'd find out soon enough anyway. Prices in this part of Anfield have faltered in recent years. Houses in Wolverton Street with central heating and double glazing are now marketed at an average of £32,950. It's not the best of markets at the moment, says Alex Dixon, of Anfield agents Sutton Kirsch, but if this particular house came up, the murder tale might create that extra little bit of interest. Raymond Chandler reckoned the case would always be unbeatable. 70 years on, crime buffs are still drawn to this quiet Liverpool backwater, to gaze at the Wallace house and to wonder at its secret.
2. The Big Greyman of Ben Macdhui. Amphir Lathmore, known also as the Big Greyman of Ben Macdhui, or simply as the Greyman, is the name given to a creature said to live on Ben Macdhui, the second highest mountain, which is situated in the Cairngorm in the eastern highlands of Scotland. Stories about the Greyman have been recorded as early as 1791, though the most famous account was given in 1925, by a highly respected scientist and mountaineer, who was on Ben Macdhui in 1891. Actual sightings of this creature have been rare. The 1925 account, for instance, did not even involve a glimpse of the Greyman. Despite the lack of sightings, the Greyman has often been described as being 3 meters, 9.8 feet, in height, with very long arms and legs, an ape-like head, and covered in short hair. The Greyman has also sometimes been compared to the Yeti of the Himalayas or the Bigfoot of North America. Nevertheless, the Greyman is not a creature of flesh and bone, but has been likened to a ghost. Regardless, all who claim to have had encountered this creature were filled with dread. The earliest known account of an alleged sighting of the Greyman dates to 1791, and comes from by a poet by the name of James Hogg. The poet is said to have been tending sheep on Ben Macdhui when he saw the creature. It was a giant blackamoor, at least 30 feet high, and equally proportioned, and very near me. I was actually struck powerless with astonishment and terror. Terrified by what he saw, Hogg fled home, only returning the next day to collect his sheep. The creature returned, and this time, Hogg is said to have decided to conduct a little experiment. The poet took off his hat, and he saw that the creature did the same as well. Thus, Hogg concluded that it was his own shadow in the fog that so terrified him the previous day. Although Hogg had proven that the creature he saw was just his shadow, the story of the Greyman had been born, and its existence seems to have become a reality. In 1925, a speech was given at the 27th Annual General Meeting of the Cairngorm Club in Aberdeen by Professor J. Norman Colley, a professor of organic chemistry at University College London, and a mountaineer. The professor spoke about his experience on the summit of Ben Macdhui back in 1891, which has since been quoted rather frequently. I was returning from the cairn on the summit in a mist when I began to think I heard something else than merely the noise of my own footsteps. For every few steps I took I heard a crunch, and then another crunch as if someone was walking after me but taking steps 3 or 4 times the length of my own. I said to myself, this is all nonsense. I listened and heard it again, but could see nothing in the mist. As I walked on and the eerie crunch, crunch, sounded behind me, I was seized with terror and took to my heels, staggering blindly among the boulders for 4 or 5 miles nearly down to Rothmerch's forest. Whatever you make of it, I do not know, but there is something very queer about the top of Ben Macdhui, and I will not go back there again by myself, I know. The professor's testimony is said to have sparked a sensation, and soon, other hikers too reported that they have had similar experiences on Ben Macdhui. They, however, did not share their stories prior to this due to fear of ridicule. Most stories about the Greyman revolved around these elements, a feeling that one is being followed, and sounds perceived as following footsteps. Such sounds could have been produced by one of the many animals living on Ben Macdhui, and not necessarily by an unknown creature like the Greyman. Few sightings of the Greyman have ever been made, and the closest pieces of physical evidence that we seem to have of this creature are its alleged footprints. In his book, Romantic Strathspey, James A. Rennie wrote that he had seen and photographed large footprints in the snow in the Spey Valley, about 24 kilometers, 15 miles, from Ben Macdhui. On a later occasion, Rennie had the opportunity to see how the footprints were formed. These footprints, according to the author, were not formed by some mysterious creature, but by precipitation. It seems that there is not much solid evidence that point to the existence of the Greyman. Hogg's creature, for instance, was his own feeling, whilst Rennie's footprints in the snow were formed due to precipitation. Furthermore, it is usually a hiker's own feeling, that she is being followed on Ben Macdhui, that has contributed to the tales of the Greyman. Even Colley's story, which is normally regarded as the most authoritative, speaks about the professor's own gut feeling. Moreover, it has been said that the professor was himself a believer in the occult, and therefore, was perhaps likely to have felt that he was being followed by an unknown creature whilst on the summit of Ben Macdhui in 1891.
3. The Great Amherst Mystery. One of the most frightening and highly publicized cases of preternatural activity was a haunting that people of Amherst, Nova Scotia, called the Great Amherst Mystery. A powerful unseen force tormented, hurt, and traumatized Esther Cox and her family for a year starting in 1878. They were cast into a hell they could not escape from that included embarrassing scrutiny and mockery by skeptics. Intense paranormal activity was witnessed by neighbors, scientists, clergymen, doctors and investigators, and the life of a young woman and her family would forever be changed after this shattering event. In contrast to the haunting of a physical location, these malicious hauntings followed an 18-year-old girl from place to place. Then one day they became so severe she had to leave her home for good. This case stands apart from other hauntings because of the credible witnesses. They actually observed many shocking events happen to and around Esther. This happened even while she was in full view and unable to cause the events directly herself. While some people believe this may have been a poltergeist, in which the intense disturbed emotions of a young female may cause strange inexplicable psychic manifestations, others think something more sinister and external was at work. The Great Amherst Mystery began in August of 1878, and lasted into the last half of 1879. Esther Cox lived with a number of relatives in a cottage house in Amherst. Reportedly, the precipitating event took place when Esther was the subject of an attempted sexual assault with a gun by Bob McNeil. He was a family acquaintance that she had developed a fondness for, despite rumors that he was of poor character. Esther was traumatized by the assault, and her behavior changed. Her sisters witnessed her crying herself to sleep, and she seemed depressed. But they just assumed the emotional girl merely had a falling out with Bob. Esther hadn't told them of the assault. Strange things began happening shortly after the event with Bob. Esther and her sister, Jane, shared a bedroom, and they began to hear strange rustling sounds under the bed. At first, the subtle noises led them to believe it was just a mouse. But events intensified quickly, when on subsequent nights the noises would be accompanied by intensely frightening experiences that would prove this was no mouse. During the first several nights, Esther's body swelled up in agony, causing her to feel she would explode. Her body changed from burning hot to frosty cold in a matter of seconds. She went into spasms and trances, and she said things that she later did not recall. The blankets and pillows flew off the bed repeatedly even after family members replaced them. Also, writing appeared on the wall above Esther's bed saying, "Esther Cox, you're mine to kill." There were strikingly loud sounds like claps of thunder that appeared to originate from under the bed, and later from the roof. Initially, the witnesses were Esther and her sister Jane, their other sister Olive and her husband Dan, Don's brother, and Esther's brother. There were also 2 young children belonging to Olive and Dan living in the house. Although they did not want to bring any attention to themselves for fear of mockery, the horrifying events led the family to call in a doctor to see if he could help. Dr. Carrot was amazed by the unfolding manifestations. He witnessed the writing on the wall, the loud claps, and also what appeared to be intelligent rappings in response to questions that were asked of the ghosts. Neighborhood residents became aware that something strange was going on at Esther's home. The noises had become so loud that they could be heard from up to 200 yards from the house. Dr. Carrot described it as if someone was banging on the roof with a sledgehammer. The Great Amherst Mystery was becoming well known around town. Things moved in the house by themselves, flew through the air or manifested out of nothing. Household items disappeared from one location only to reappear in another, and later, fires erupted mysteriously. The hauntings would at times stop, only to start up again, but often they followed Esther wherever she went. She began to hear voices, and see the entities that tormented her in various ways. They frightened her and also harmed her physically. Life had become so intolerable for the family, with the frightful occurrences and fires that had been set in the house, that Esther had to leave her home. She was taken in by a kind family that allowed her to work in their dining saloon, but the hauntings followed her. Townsfolk witnessed many amazing things in the saloon. A knife that mysteriously flew through the air stabbed Esther. But after someone pulled it out of her, it flew back again into the same wound. Scientists, clergymen, and other doctors investigated the hauntings. A well-known reverend visited and witnessed a bucket of cold water on the kitchen table appear to boil. A Baptist clergyman, Dr. Edwin Clay, defended Esther after investigating, and drawing the conclusion that she was not causing the manifestations herself. Dr. Clay spoke about the authenticity of the case at many lectures, where crowds of people gathered to listen. Townsfolk gathered at Esther's cottage inside and out, trying to get a glimpse of the objects flying through the air, or to hear the thunderous booms, or communicate with the ghosts through questions and rappings. Esther even went to St. John, New Brunswick, where she was investigated by a group of scientists, who purportedly communicated with the ghosts and determined that it was a number of entities that were actually haunting her. In June of 1879, Walter Hubble, investigator and author, spent 6 weeks in the home of Esther Cox to document the Amherst haunting. He claims to have been the victim of his own paranormal events that took place at Esther's house, and he witnessed many violent occurrences with Esther. Later, in 1879 he published his report called The Haunted House, A True Ghost Story. He also published a book, The Great Amherst Mystery. Hubble included affidavits of 13 witnesses, who swore that they experienced the paranormal events firsthand. Each time Esther returned home to the family cottage, the manifestations intensified. While she was working for Arthur Davison, his barn burnt down, and he accused Esther of arson, for which she spent a month in prison. After this, the paranormal events slowly subsided. Esther would go on to live her life, and she would marry twice. She had 2 children, and eventually she moved to Brockton, Massachusetts with her second husband. And although Esther would carry on, the great Amherst mystery would forever be burned into the lives and memory of a town that would be known for one of the most highly publicized paranormal events of all time.
4. The disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst. Benjamin Bathurst was a British diplomatic envoy, who disappeared in Germany under strange circumstances in 1809, in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. He was the 3rd son of Henry Bathurst, Bishop of Norwich. Bathurst is reported to have suddenly disappeared on, or about November 25, 1809. His vanishing sparked much debate and speculation concerning his ultimate fate, as his disappearance was unexplained and particularly sudden. Some considered it to be a supernatural vanishing. Recent research suggests the circumstances of Bathurst's disappearance were not that wildly exaggerated. However, it is now suggested he was almost certainly murdered, and his body disposed of. The strange events surrounding his disappearance. On 25 November 1809, Benjamin Bathurst and his attendant were in the middle of making a long and dangerous journey carriage across Europe. That evening they had stopped for refreshments in a small inn at the town of Perlberg, west of Berlin. They had intended to stop for just an hour or so. Concerned about standing out as rich British, they both been traveling under false names. Baron de Koch and Fisher. Records show that sometime between 9 and 10 in the evening, Benjamin Bathurst and his loyal attendant Fisher were considering if they should set off in the carriage and continue the long journey they had planned for that day. The carriage was indeed ready up with fresh horses and set to roll. However, for some reason, they decided that it was too late to travel such a long distance, so decided to retire to bed in the inn. Before they did, they had to deal with their horses and carriage. Bathurst left the inn they had stopped at first, with his attendant less than a few meters behind him to unharness his horses. Records show he climbed into the carriage after examining the horses. Bathurst's attendant followed the diplomat into the carriage just a few moments later. However, when he got to the door of the vehicle, there was no sign of Bathurst. The attendant quickly looked, but failed to find any trace of the missing Baron. He then went back inside the inn, and gathered a large group of locals to help him search for the missing diplomat. The group helped him search the local area for over an hour, but there was no sign of the British diplomat anywhere. Vanished without a trace. On December 16 a report came in from 2 local women, who had been taking a walk through the nearby woods. They had come across a pair of pants which were later proven to belong to Bathurst. The pants had 2 bullet holes shot through them, but there was a lack of any blood evidence. This indicated to authorities that the clothing had been shot after it was taken off the diplomat. Bathurst's wife eventually got wind of his disappearance, and traveled to Perlberg herself to find out what had happened to her husband. Once she arrived, she immediately put up a high reward offer for anyone who had information on her husband's whereabouts. The reward was cancelled after several days due to the amount of hoax responses from local opportunists.
5. The Lost Sublet Mine. In the southern end of the Guadalupes, on the east side, is a canyon like a chasm, sheer on both sides, accessible only by a rope. It varies in width from 50 to 100 feet, and is perhaps 75 feet deep. In the wall, near the floor of the canyon, is a shaft, like a cave. In the cave, according to the recollections of Ross Sublet, is the deposit of gold. So ends an excerpt from one of the most famous treasure hunting books of all time, Lost Mines and Hidden Treasure, by Leland Lovelace. The above concerns one of the most famous gold mines in Texas, the Lost Sublet somewhere in the Guadalupe Mountains of West Texas. There are many accounts of gold in the Guadalupe Mountains. It was the Apache stronghold. Gold nuggets and gold sand has been found in the streams of these mountains, but the mother lode has never been located. Part of this range of mountains crosses into New Mexico. There is a large part also that is now a national park, and is off limits. But it is a matter of conjecture as to the location of the lost Sublette is within the park grounds or not. One thing is certain is the gold mine did really exist, and searching for gold in these mountains could be rewarding, but these mountains are still wild. William Caldwell Sublette was born in Kentucky, some accounts say Tennessee. As a teenager he made his way to Missouri. There he married Laura Louise Denny. The two bought a wagon and 2 mules, and headed for Colorado and the mines. Sublette had no luck in Colorado and went to Texas, and landed in Montans. Here they lived in a tent. Laura took in washing. Sublette found odd jobs in town. He did work at local stores and painted houses. It is said Sublette drank quite a bit, and this made it harder for him to keep work. He would sometimes show up for work drunk. It is told how his drinking got around town and it hurt his reputation. During his idle times between jobs, Sublette would hitch up his 2 mules and roam the Guadalupe Mountains prospecting. The mountains were 125 miles from where he lived, so he would be gone quite a while. He was warned also of the Apache danger in the mountains, but he ignored these warnings. It wasn't long before the folks thought Sublette crazy. He became known as Old Ben and was looked on as demented. During his marriage, Ben and Laura had 3 children. One was a boy and there were 2 girls. Laura got Ben to move to Odessa so the kids would have a better chance of getting an education. Ben did not really want to, but, to humor Laura, he did. After a few months of living in Odessa, Laura died from tuberculosis. This left Ben with 3 kids. The oldest daughter took over the washing clothes for money, and the mother duties of the 2 youngest, and Ben found what work he could, which wasn't much. On one job, Ben was working with an old Mescalero Apache. They got to be friends. Ben told him he would go into the Guadalupes and prospect for gold. The old Apache told Ben where there was much gold in the Guadalupes. The Apache said he could never return to the tribe as he had been banished. He told Ben the location of the gold as best he could. Ben took off to the mountains as often as he could. It was not an easy task searching for the gold by the Indians' directions, but he continued feeling he would find it at any time. Ben finally found the gold. He returned to Odessa, and went into Molly Williams' saloon and dumped a sack full of gold nuggets on the bar. Ben bought drinks for everyone. Ben was now a rich man. He claimed he had found the richest gold mine in all of North America. Ben took care of his children first, buying them new clothes and getting them into school. He also bought a new wagon and 2 new mules. Ben would go to the Guadalupes every 3 weeks, and bring back gold. It is known that one jeweler took some, and said they were the purest gold he had ever seen in the natural state. Many Odessa citizens approached Ben with deals to go partners with him. Ben refused them all. He did tell them, however, that not long ago they all thought of him as crazy. Ben was followed nearly all the time he would leave for his mine. Knowing this, Ben would always do things to confuse the followers. He would sometimes go to the Pecos River and camp several days there, and then return to Odessa. At times he would just elude his trackers, and return with more gold. Ben would always convert his gold into cash. He would get the cash in Odessa, and then place it into a bank in Midland owned by W.E. Connell. Connell noticed when Ben was short in his account he would go to the Guadalupes, and in 2 or 3 weeks he would come back with a big deposit. Connell offered Ben $10,000 for his gold claim. Ben laughed at this, saying he could pick that up in one afternoon. Connell and his partner, Gray, hired a tracker from Midland named Jim Flanagan to keep an eye out for Ben's next trip. Flanagan loved this job as all he had to do was hang around bars, and get paid for it until Gray and Connell needed him, or he heard Ben was on his way to his mine. Finally, Connell contacted him and told him Ben would be leaving soon as his account was running low. Ben left Odessa a few days later heading for the Guadalupes. Flanagan gave Ben a 2-hour head start, and followed him easily by the wagon track. Flanagan trailed Ben 3 days with no problem. Then, Flanagan tried to find the tracks but with no luck. He went back to Odessa. Ben had small stashes of his gold between the mountains and Odessa. 2 years passed and Ben got to know Grizzly Bill. Grizzly Bill was also an old prospector. He was like Ben, as he had to do odd jobs also to keep himself in bread and butter. Ben took pity on Grizzly Bill and told him his mine in the Guadalupe mountain had a flour sack full of gold. In Odessa, Grizzly Bill spent the next 2 days celebrating. During his 2 days, Grizzly Bill got on a horse trying to break it. Being drunk was Grizzly Bill's undoing, for he was sent flying into the air, and died with a broken neck. Then there was Mike Wilson. Mike took directions easily, and went into the Guadalupes, and brought back several sacks of gold. Wilson went on a 3-day drinking binge, and blew all his gold. Wilson went back into the Guadalupes for more gold, but he could not find the location again. He got lost and wandered around for several days. He went back to Ben and told him he could no longer find the mine. Ben was not pleased with the way Wilson had blown all the gold on a spree and refused to tell him the location again. Wilson spent the rest of his days searching, but finally passed away in a cabin at the foothills of the Guadalupes. Another fellow Ben may have told the secret to was named Rufus Stuart, who was a guide for hunters, but also worked as a house painter and stagecoach driver. Stuart was camped one evening with some officials from the Texas and Pacific Railroad on a hunting trip. They were on the Pecos River not far from the town of Menton. In the morning, Stuart was going to lead the men into the Guadalupe hunting for deer and antelope. After the evening meal, the railroad men were sleeping, and Stuart was doing the dishes and cleaning up. He heard the approach of a wagon. About 20 yards from the camp the wagon pulled up. It was Ben Sublett. Stuart knew him as a nut from Odessa. He had also heard of Ben's famous gold mine in the Guadalupes. Stuart invited Ben to come and sit and have a cup of coffee. Ben told Stuart he was heading into the Guadalupes to get more gold. Ben also told Stuart this could be his last trip, as he was getting too old to make the trip. He said the hiking and climbing to get to the mine was getting too hard, and he also said he had enough gold to last him the rest of his life. Ben asked Stuart if he would like to go along to the gold. Stuart had to decline, as he told Ben he had a responsibility to the hunters. He also said he wasn't risking his life going into an area where renegade Indians sometimes were roaming. Stuart and Ben talked until the early morning hours. Ben told Stuart he would like to show him the location to the mine. Ben would give him directions. The two rode a few miles west of camp, and to a point of high ground. To the west, Ben pointed to a blue mound. At that point he showed Stuart, through a telescope, the directions to the mine. The two men returned to camp. Ben then got into his wagons, and went toward the Guadalupes. Ben said he would return to the camp in about 3 days. 3 days passed, and on the evening of the 3rd day, old Ben pulled his wagon into camp. Ben joined Stuart and the hunters for their dinner. When dinner was over and Stuart and Ben were sitting by the campfire, Ben said he had something to show Stuart. Ben spread a blanket next to the fire, and displayed a large quantity of gold. Stuart was in the position of being one of those folks who experienced the seeing is believing emotion. He was shocked to see the size of the nuggets. Ben said the large nuggets were easier to pick up than the small ones. He said there was over 1,000 more lying in the dry creek bed. Ben gave Stuart one of the large nuggets. Ben stayed overnight at the camp. He then left the next morning. Stuart never saw him again. Stuart went in search of the mine a few weeks later. He went to the blue mound Ben had taken him to. Using the directions Ben gave him, he rode into the Guadalupes. He searched for many days but no luck. Stuart made other search trips but still no luck. Ben had a son, Rael. He knew the location of the mine as a child. He went to the mine with his father. All he could ever recall was being lowered to the bottom of a canyon by rope. As a kid, it meant nothing to him. Rael paid no attention to his surroundings. Later, a grown man, he would regret this. Many times Rael, as an adult, would search for his birthright but never found it. In 1892, Ben Sublett passed away in Odessa. He had in his life become a fairly rich man. At his death most of his fortune was gone, and there was little left. But Ben left a treasure legacy of a very rich mine that still waits finding. Treasure hunter and writer W.C. Jameson says he left a history of one of the richest lost mines of gold in the Great Southwest. Jameson has searched the Guadalupes, and believes the mine is there. It is said that the Guadalupes are not conducive to gold, as the weathered sedimentary structure of what was once an undersea algae reef is not conducive to the formation of gold ore. But, according to Jameson, hydrothermal solutions, under pressure, penetrate the rock surrounding an underground pocket of molten material. There are experts who claim this activity has not happened in the Guadalupes. This is also prone to some disagreement. In every direction there are exposed landforms, and mountains which are intrusively and extrusively volcanic in origin. It is considered a folly to think this type of activity has not taken place between the mountains and below. When Jameson was on a treasure hunting expedition in 1987, samples of igneous intrusive rock were found. They were found on the southeast-facing slope of the escarpment in the same area where the lost Sublet mine is supposed to be located. Rolf Sublet never found his dad's gold mine. The Sublet family still exists in this part of New Mexico and Texas. It is their legacy, and it is anybody's guess if Ben's descendants still look for the gold mine. The nearest guess seems to pinpoint on the outer edges of the park. This may or not be the same gold as the Apache. All that seems certain is there is a source of gold located somewhere in the Guadalupe Mountains.
6. The Aurora Incident. In 1897, a very strange incident occurred in the tiny North Texas town of Aurora, on Saturday, April 17, 1897 at 6 o'clock in the morning. A cigar-shaped UFO, metallic silver in color, appeared suddenly in the sky above Aurora. It was moving from south to north. Unlike the balloon airships of its time, this UFO was built of an unknown metal, resembling somewhat a mix of aluminum and silver. A witness guessed that the ship weighed several tons. The sighting occurred during a time when many strange airships were being seen all over the United States. For this reason, the UFO is called an airship in a newspaper article written later, by Aurora resident S.E. Hayden. Hayden told the Dallas Morning News that the strange craft seemed to be having some kind of mechanical problems. It slowed down to about 10 or 12 miles per hour, and began settling toward the ground. Hayden said the townspeople watched in amazement, as the slow-moving airship drifted over the town square, and then moved north toward the property of Judge J.S. Proctor. Next, the UFO collided with a windmill on the judge's land, and went into pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground. The crash destroyed the windmill, the adjacent water tank and the judge's flower garden. It seems likely that the explosion and crash drew many spectators to Judge Proctor's land. Among the wreckage, the townspeople found the dead body of the ship's pilot. Then the story got really weird. Witnesses said that the pilot was not a human being. Hayden said that, although the pilot's body was damaged severely in the crash, it was clear that he was not an inhabitant of this world. The pilot may have been from Mars, said another witness, Mr. T.J. Weems, an officer in the U.S. Signal Service and an authority on astronomy. In the case of the UFO that exploded in 1891 over Dublin, Texas, papers were found containing strange writing on them. The same thing happened in Aurora. When the townspeople checked the pilot's body, they found that he was carrying papers written in an unknown language. The papers may have contained a record of the pilot's journeys, but they were written in some unknown hieroglyphics, and could not be understood. As word of what happened reached surrounding towns, many visitors arrived to look at the crash site. Hayden commented, "The town is full of people today who are viewing the wreck, and gathering specimens of the strange metal from the debris. It's possible that some of that mysterious wreckage, that was carried away from Aurora still exists today, stored away and forgotten in attics or storage rooms. No trace of it has ever been found, though." After the crash, the townspeople tried to find out more about how the UFO was constructed, and what made it fly. However, Hayden said that the ship was too badly wrecked to form any conclusion as to its construction or motive power. The Dallas Morning News article, published 2 days after the crash, said that the pilot's funeral would take place on April 18. Another newspaper, the Fort Worth Register, said, "The pilot, who was not an inhabitant of this world, was given proper Christian burial at the Aurora Cemetery. When the pilot was buried, a marker was placed on his grave." In 1973, Newspaper reporter Bill Case described the marker as having a strange design on it resembling a flying saucer with portholes. Shortly after Case wrote a story describing the grave marker, somebody stole it. Today, nobody is sure exactly where the pilot was buried. In 2008, an unmarked grave dating back to the 1890s was found at the Aurora Cemetery, during the filming of a television show called UFO Hunters for the History Channel. Since the owners of the cemetery will not allow anyone to dig up the grave, nobody knows if it is the grave of the strange pilot. Although some people claim the story is not true, and was created by Aurora residents to boost tourism, many other people do believe that a spaceship crash-landed there. The case of the alien that fell from the sky in Aurora, Texas, continues to fascinate people to this very day. It still remains as much of a mystery today as it was back in 1897.
7. The Black Mausoleum. The Mackenzie Poltergeist is quite an odd story and deserves your attention. It must have seemed like a good idea at the time. The homeless man was without a bed and the night was chilly. When he found the door to the mausoleum open, it could have looked inviting, but quite why he decided to open a coffin and snuggle down beside the skeleton is less easy to explain. He may have been fine had the entire coffin not crumbled on top of him, showering him with the dust of a 400-year-old corpse. He let out a rather loud scream, which was heard by a passing dog walker, who let out an even louder scream when he saw what looked like a zombie coming straight for him. There followed a Scooby-Doo moment when they, and the dog, ran around the graveyard screaming before running off in opposite directions. What neither the homeless man nor the dog walker realized was that the mausoleum belonged to one of the most monstrous residents of the graveyard of Greyfriars Kirk, the 17th-century judge and Lord Advocate Sir George Mackenzie, otherwise known as Bluety Mackenzie, who executed a large number of Covenanters. The Covenanters were a powerful political force in Scotland in the 17th century. On 1638, a large gathering signed the National Covenant in Greyfriars Kirkyard, pledging to keep Scotland a Presbyterian country. This document formed the basis of a treaty, whereby the Scottish government would support the parliamentarians in the English Civil War. However, 50 years later Charles II was on the throne, the Covenanters had been outlawed, and they were heavily defeated by the King's forces at the Battle of Bothwell Brig. In all, 18,000 Covenanters died for their beliefs, 1,200 were imprisoned in the Covenanters' prison in Greyfriars Kirkyard by Mackenzie. Some were executed and their heads displayed around the prison walls. The rest were corralled in the yard, and left without food or water. Hundreds died, and for some the last face they would have seen was the mocking, jubilant and hateful face of Bluety Mackenzie. Posted image: the Black Mausoleum, the last resting place of Sir George Mackenzie. Ironically, George Mackenzie was himself buried in Greyfriars. Then in 1999 along came our homeless man. Poltergeist theory would claim that the disturbance of Mackenzie's coffin was the trigger that awoke the ghost, and now it haunts the Black Mausoleum, Mackenzie's last resting place. Soon stories of blackouts, attacks and spooky goings-on abounded. It all became too much for Edinburgh City Council. They locked the door, threw away the key and declared the area out of bounds, for the living anyway. Jan Andrew Henderson lived in a flat overlooking the graveyard. He was amused by the stories of haunting, and puzzled by the council's decision. Not slow to spot a business opportunity, Mr. Henderson, who runs ghost tours of the old city, asked the council for permission to bring tours to the mausoleum. And that is when things really began to escalate, as Jan explains. "I am a very scientific person, and I don't know if I believe in ghosts or not," Mr. Henderson says, "but I just don't have an explanation for the sheer number of people who have collapsed, had their fingers broken or whatever. I've even had phone calls from 2 people who say their partner has now been committed, and blame it on the ghost. I just don't have an explanation for the sheer number of people who have collapsed, had fingers broken or whatever. Since 1999, there have been 350 documented attacks. 170 people have collapsed. Tourists have reported hot spots, cold spots, somewhere in the middle spots. They have been bloodied and bruised, pushed and pulled, by an unseen and altogether unwanted visitor to the Black Mausoleum. Mr. Henderson tries hard to keep an open mind, and maintains that until he himself is hurt by the thing, he refuses to believe in it. But he has not gone unscathed. There is a lot of so-called poltergeist activity associated with the area: fires, loads and loads of dead animals that can't be explained, that kind of thing. Holy hell, the thing even burnt down my own house. All my papers and notes about the Mackenzie Poltergeist were destroyed. With his flat gutted, Mr. Henderson moved away and has stopped taking people round the graveyard. The tours still continue and night after night visitors spook themselves. Most leave entertained, some leave a little frightened, and others walk away from the Black Mausoleum convinced that they have had a close brush with something very nasty indeed.
8. The Hornet Spook Light. The setting is unimpressive. A gravel road lined by trees and weed-choked ditches connects Newton County, in the southwest corner of Missouri, with equally rural parts of Oklahoma. This is County Road E50, better known as Spook Light Road. And something that is impressive happens there often. The Spook Light, found south of Joplin, Missouri, is a glowing orb the size of a basketball that floats down the road from Oklahoma. If you're sitting in a car waiting for the light, it often dances on the hood of the car, winks out, and reappears behind the car like it had gone right through the cab. The locals say this happens a lot. Roberta Williams, from nearby Carthage, Missouri, has seen the spook light, and she knows it's real. It was before midnight, she said. It was like a big, huge ball with a yellow glow, and it went right straight through our car. I just screamed. According to local legend, two Quapaw Indian lovers, chased by warriors and an angry father, jumped from a cliff into the Spring River and died. The spook light is supposedly one of the young American Indians walking this quiet road searching for their lost love. The light gained prominence when white settlers moved into the southwest corner of Missouri in 1886, but the local American Indians reported seeing the light in the early 1800s, said historian Virginia Hoare of Seneca, Missouri. People have seen the light ever since. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers studied the light in 1946, but couldn't find the source. Explanations range from gas escaping from the abundant shale in the area, to refracted automobile headlights, to UFOs, and ball lightning. Northwest Missouri State University physics professor David Richardson planned to investigate the spook light with colleagues in 2011, but the EF5 tornado that struck nearby Joplin 2 months before the study put it on hold. I've always been fascinated by ball lightning, and if the Joplin spook lights failed the first hypothesis, headlights, then I'd have turned to ball lightning, Richardson said. Having a place that regularly produces ball lightning would be awesome to study, if in fact the location produced it. Ball lightning in nature is, as of yet, unexplained, although it has been created in the laboratory. Regardless of what causes the light, it's there. Locals have seen it often, including Hoare. When I was in high school, and I graduated in 1934, I saw it, she said. It came right through the car. We saw it coming toward us and I looked out the back window, and I saw it had passed through the car. Former mayor of Seneca Gary Rourke has never seen the spook light, but knows many who have. It's a little bit like people with stories about UFOs, Rourke said. There's no doubt they've seen something, but what it is anybody's guess. A building sits at the turn off to Spook Light Road. Although it's a private residence now, it used to be the Spook Light Museum. The museum was originally owned by Arthur Spooky Meadows, who later sold it to Garland Spooky Middleton. Middleton sold soda to people who stopped to see the spook light. Bill Caldwell, librarian for the nearby Joplin Globe, said he knows why people are interested in the light. It's such a community happening. It's just part of the landscape, he said. It is unexplained and intangible. There's just no way to know what it is. To find Spook Light Road from Joplin, take Interstate 44 to exit 4, Missouri 43 south 4 miles to Gum Road, turn west on Gum Road to a T, turn south, then turn west onto E50. Hoare has advice on the best place to park. You never know quite where to stop on the road, Hoare said. But people say, where do you find the most beer cans? That's where you can stop and see the spook light. I trusted Virginia, she's seen the light.
9. The murder of Julie Rael. Adolf Hitler was easily the most hated man in history. His name speaks of irreversible evil committed in his honor. It speaks of millions of deaths, the most horrible war the world has ever known, insanity given room to thrive, and countless other things. Despite all the vile things Hitler is known for, he is also known for loving his half-niece Julie Rael quite obsessively. However, even that is steeped in violence. Julie Rael officially killed herself, though some think the official cause of death is incorrect. They think she was murdered by her adoring uncle Adolf Hitler. Did Adolf Hitler kill his niece? Julie Angelica Maria Rael was the daughter of Leo Rael Sr. and his wife Angela Rael. Angela was Adolf Hitler's half-sister. They shared the same father, Alois Hitler. Angela was a product of Alois' second marriage, while Adolf was a product of his third. Adolf grew up with his half-sister and was reportedly very fond of her daughter. Julie lost her father when she was only 2 years old. 15 years later, she went to live with Adolf Hitler, who had taken in her mother as a housekeeper. From the time Julie moved into her uncle's home until her death, she was under his watchful eye. In fact, at the time of her death, her mother was living in a different home than Julie. Julie was living in Adolf's apartment in Munich. Sources close to them say that Adolf doted on her. Some even say that he was obsessed with her, despite their family ties and age difference. He was 19 years her senior. The more sordid stories may be gossip. There are no existing papers from either of them admitting such an affair. The rumors were not only sexual, though. It seemed to some that Julie was a sort of prisoner of Adolf's. He denied this publicly, but the fact is that she was a vibrant young girl who certainly lived under his thumb. Since Julie Rael's death, there has been a lot of speculation about her mental state, due to her death being ruled a suicide. It seems she wished to go to Vienna, either to become a dancer or see a lover, depending on who you believe, but that Hitler refused to allow this. There are also rumors that she was pregnant at the time of her death, leading many to wonder who the father was. Was it Hitler? Was it the mysterious and possibly made-up lover in Vienna? Or was it Emil Morris? Emil was a chauffeur of Hitler's who asked Hitler if he could marry Julie. Hitler threatened him with a pistol, chased him off and fired him. Emil later sued successfully for lost wages. Interestingly, Emil later got his job back, but it was too late for him and Julie. Another interesting theory regarding Julie's presumed sadness is the matter of Eva Braun. Eva was seeing Hitler at the time of Julie's death. She was even younger than Julie, who was 23 years old when she died. Is it possible that Julie was jealous? By most accounts, Julie was indifferent to Hitler's love interests. She was a young girl who liked nice things and liked to socialize. It is doubtful that she was in love with her uncle, but Eva Braun certainly was. Obviously, stranger things have happened. Most accounts suggest that Rael and her uncle were fighting in the days leading up to the mysterious discovery of her body. Was Julie depressed at all? Did she have any reason to commit suicide? According to Hitler's servants at the Munich apartment, Julie was found in her room around 9:30 a.m. on September 19, 1931. She was on the floor dead with a single bullet wound to her chest. The door was locked from the inside, necessitating a break-in by the butler. The gun was a Walther belonging to Hitler. It was on the couch. A note in the room Julie was writing to a friend about visiting Vienna was half-written, trailing off mid-word by some accounts. The coroner ruled her death a suicide without conducting an autopsy. He found she suffered a broken nose and bruises. He said the break came from the fall she took upon dying, and that the bruises came after death. He said she had died the day before. The day before Julie Rael died, Hitler left for Nuremberg with Heinrich Hoffmann. What time they left is anyone's guess, but years later, Heinrich wrote that Julie had been helping Hitler pack when he arrived. He also said she was alive when they left. The servants told police that Julie went into Hitler's room and then her room around 3 p.m. on September 18. One of the servants said that she later heard a sound that might have been a gunshot. Interestingly, no one investigated until the following morning. They presumably heard no sound from her room the entire night, save a gunshot-like sound, yet did nothing. There was a lot of talk about the scenario, both in Germany at the time and the world over later. Unfortunately, most of what we know about Traubel's death is talk. The police conducted a scant investigation, at best. Staff and friends said very little about the matter until Hitler was dead, more than 10 years later. Therefore, it is difficult to pin down enough information even to say whether the coroner's conclusion was valid, let alone right. Rumor has it that the pistol Hitler used to kill himself was the very same pistol from which Julie caught a bullet. Even that supposed suicide is a mystery.